This story is titled, My Parents Lived on My Money Until, at a birthday party, it turned out that they were mocking me as a stupid, unemployed son. I cut them off, and now they are begging for financial help. Hey everyone, I'm sitting in my apartment right now, 31 years old, and I can't stop thinking about my sister's birthday party last year. That day changed everything with my family, and I find myself constantly replaying every moment in my head. I've tried drowning myself in work to forget, but the memories keep floating back. Looking at old family photos only makes it worse. I think it's time to finally tell what happened. Maybe writing it down will help me process everything. I grew up in a small town in Michigan. It's the kind of place where gossip spreads faster than wildfire, which sounds cozy until you're the one everyone's whispering about. We had a traditional family setup: mom, dad, me, and my little sister Jessica, who's 8 years younger than me. My grandparents lived with us too for a while. They were the only ones who treated me like I mattered, and I still miss them every day. From day one, Jessica was the princess of the house. I don't blame her for being the favorite. Everyone could see it, even the neighbors. I remember all the special treatment she got. Teachers would always say how gifted she was, and her birthdays were like royal celebrations with decorations that would put wedding planners to shame. Gifts piled up like mountains, and my parents would spend months planning everything. They even got local newspaper coverage once for her sweet 16. Meanwhile, my birthdays were always an afterthought. They usually got combined with other family events, and I remember one year they forgot completely. I had to remind them 3 days later. I usually ended up with something practical like notebooks or socks. Times were tough, they said. But somehow, there was always money for Jessica's new phone every year, private tutors for every subject, and designer clothes while I wore hand-me-downs. It wasn't just birthdays either. When Jessica joined the debate team in high school, my parents never missed a single competition. They were always cheering her on like she was solving world peace, making special banners for every event, and they even drove 3 states over for nationals. Meanwhile, during my final basketball game as team captain, there were empty seats where my parents should have been. Had to take Jessica to her violin recital, they said. I still have the team photo, just me standing there while other parents hugged their kids. My coach tried to console me, but the damage was done. That was the story of my life right there. My grandparents were the real MVPs, though, especially Grandma. She'd always try to make things fair and call out my parents when they were being obvious about favorites. She'd secretly get me real birthday presents and hide them under my bed so my parents wouldn't know. She made me feel like someone cared. But nothing really changed, and then they both passed away within months of each other. Grandpa died of a heart attack, and Grandma couldn't handle the grief, following him 2 months later. It felt like watching my safety net disappear. And after that, my parents started leaning on me more. Though, not in the way you'd expect. By the time I graduated high school, I already knew college wasn't happening for me. I had always dreamed of becoming an architect and spent countless nights sketching building designs. I even won a state competition for architectural design in my senior year, but my parents shut that down immediately. We don't have money for that, they said, like that was the end of the discussion. Meanwhile, Jessica got private tutoring for everything: SAT prep, music lessons, debate coaching, each costing more than my entire year's clothes budget. I had to figure out my own path, so I moved to Chicago after graduation with only $200 and a backpack to my name. I got an entry-level job at an architectural firm, starting as a junior draftsman. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I lived in the tiniest apartment imaginable with a shared bathroom for the entire floor and ate ramen for months straight. During this time, I taught myself advanced CAD in my free time. YouTube tutorials, online courses, anything I could get my hands on. I stayed late at the office practicing on company software. My boss noticed my dedication, and after a year, I got promoted to full draftsman. I was finally starting to make decent money and could afford real food for once. That's when the calls started. My parents began calling every month, and it was always about money. It wasn't even a request anymore. You know, raising kids isn't cheap, they'd say. We've done so much for you, and it's the least you can do. They were masters at guilt tripping, both of them. I started sending them money monthly, even though I barely had enough for myself. I skipped meals to make it work and walked everywhere to save bus fare. Then Jessica got accepted into law school. My parents called me immediately, and I actually felt happy for her at first. I still cared about her despite everything. She was my little sister, after all. I remember when she used to stand up for me when we were younger. My parents couldn't contain their excitement. "She's going to be a lawyer!" Mom kept saying, like she had already passed the bar. Of course, the conversation didn't end there. Subtle hints started dropping. Law school is so expensive. Jessica will need help to succeed. You're doing so well now. Each call was longer than the last, with more guilt packed into every conversation. Dad chimed in too. It would mean so much to her if you helped. We've supported you your whole life. Conveniently forgetting all the times they didn't. I didn't even argue. Maybe it was the years of guilt they had planted in me. Or maybe I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. Maybe I just wanted them to be proud of me for once. Jessica had always been kind when we were younger, and sometimes stood up for me when our parents compared us. I remember her sharing her birthday cake with me once, the only time I got more than one slice. I wanted to support her like she had supported me back then. That's why I agreed. I ended up covering her first-year tuition and admission fees, and even helped with her living expenses. I maxed out my credit cards and took on extra freelance work so she could move closer to campus. It wasn't easy at all. I had to use all my savings and lived on a tight budget for months. I couldn't even afford new work clothes, and my boss noticed but didn't say anything. But it felt worth it at first. Jessica seemed genuinely grateful. She called me constantly those first few months, thanking me over and over. "I couldn't do this without you, David," she'd say, which made me feel like a hero for once. I remember feeling proud hearing those words, like all my sacrifices were finally worth something. All those sacrifices seemed worth it at first. Jessica would tell me about her classes, how challenging but exciting everything was, and send me pictures of her study groups. I actually felt like a real brother for once. "We've got this amazing professor," she'd say. "He's like a legend in the field. Tough, but I'm learning so much." She would send me screenshots of her good grades, and I liked hearing about her life, even if I couldn't relate. I never went to college myself, but through her stories, I got a glimpse of what it could have been like if my parents had supported me the same way. That's when things started changing. Her calls became less frequent. At first, I thought nothing of it. Law school seemed intense, and I figured she was just busy. I told myself she'd call when she could. When she did call, it was different. It was always about needing something. "Hey, David, running low on rent money. This textbook costs a fortune. Can you help?" She never asked how I was doing anymore. I always said yes. I told myself it was temporary. Once she graduated and became a lawyer, everything would even out. She'd pay me back. Maybe my parents would finally respect me. But her tone kept changing. The gratitude disappeared, replaced by expectation, like I owed her this. She treated me like her personal ATM. No thank you anymore, just a quick acknowledgement before hanging up. Sometimes she didn't even say goodbye. When I tried to ask about her life, how she was doing, she'd seem distracted and couldn't wait to end the call. Yeah, I'm fine, David. Anyway, about that rent money." I could hear her typing while talking to me. I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't want to sound petty, so I let it slide. But it started eating at me. My stomach would knot up seeing her name on my phone. I'd sit at work, thinking about all the sacrifices I was making while she barely acknowledged me. I checked my bank account every hour, wondering how to make it to the next paycheck. I was skipping things I wanted. New clothes, dinners with friends, a better apartment. I couldn't even fix my car when it broke down and had to take the bus in Chicago winter. All so she could focus on school without worrying about money. My parents made it worse. Every call was the same story. "Jessica's doing so well. We're so proud of her." They never asked about my promotion at work or the award-winning design I created. If they mentioned me at all, it was only about helping Jessica. Good that you're supporting her. That's what family does. Like I was just the family bank. They never asked how I was doing. They didn't know about the long hours at work or the freelance projects I took on just to make ends meet. They didn't know I was working weekends while she partied. I saw her spring break photos online. They didn't know how drained I felt watching my savings disappear. But honestly, I didn't expect them to ask. That's how it always was. By the end of Jessica's first year, things had completely changed. She only called for money. My texts barely got responses. I once waited 2 weeks for a reply. I remember asking about her exams and got a one-word reply the next day. "Good." That's it. No details, no follow-up. It felt like texting a stranger. I started resenting her. I didn't know how to handle it. I told myself she was just stressed, that it wasn't personal. I kept making excuses for her, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was being taken for granted, not just by Jessica, but by my parents too. One night, I got a call from Mom. She wanted to talk about Jessica, of course. I recognized that fake, cheerful tone immediately. "She's doing so well, David," she said. "You should be proud of her." It was the same speech she'd given 100 times before. I muttered something about being glad, but I guess my tone wasn't convincing enough. "What's wrong?" she asked, sounding more annoyed than concerned. I could practically hear her eyes rolling through the phone. I tried to stay quiet, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Nothing," I said. "It just feels like all I ever do is give. I've been helping Jessica nonstop and nobody even notices." My voice was shaking more than I wanted it to. There was a long pause on her end. I could hear Dad watching TV in the background. Then she sighed. That disappointed Mom's sigh. "David, don't be selfish," she said. "Jessica is doing something important. You're just working in architecture." Each word felt like a knife in my gut. "She's going to be a lawyer. You should be happy to support her." I felt my hands starting to shake. That hit hard. All my work meant nothing to her. My building designs, project management, client presentations, none of it mattered. The years I spent teaching myself, the late nights learning software, the awards I'd won, all meaningless because I didn't have a fancy degree. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. It was the same argument we'd had for years. I just said okay and hung up. I stared at my phone for an hour after that conversation. It stuck with me for weeks. I couldn't focus at work and started making mistakes on designs. I was physically and emotionally drained, but I didn't know what to do. Cutting them off seemed impossible. They were family, after all. The word family felt like a curse now. Part of me wondered how much longer until I broke. I started having anxiety attacks and couldn't sleep most nights. Then I got another call from Mom a few weeks before Jessica's birthday. I recognized her want something voice. She was unusually cheerful this time, which was a bad sign. It always meant she wanted something big. "We're having everyone over for Jessica's birthday party," she said, making it sound like a royal celebration. "Relatives, neighbors, even some of Jessica's friends." She mentioned something about a photographer. "We'll have the whole family together. You'll come, won't you?" It was more of a demand than a question. I wasn't sure at first. Going home always meant drama, and my stomach was already in knots just thinking about it. I wasn't in the mood for their games, but she kept pressing. "It's been ages since we all got together," she said, guilt dripping from every word. "Jessica would love to see you. Don't you want to spend time with family?" They were classic manipulation tactics, but I finally agreed, mostly to avoid the endless guilt trips. I knew they'd call every day until I said yes. I figured it might be a chance to reconnect, that maybe things wouldn't be so bad. How wrong I was. I took the train back to Michigan, carrying a few small gifts I'd picked up. I'd spent 2 weeks' lunch money on them, hoping they'd actually appreciate it this time. When I arrived, the house was packed. There were relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors I barely recognized, and Jessica's friends from law school. The place looked like a wedding reception with catering, decorations, and professional lighting. It must have cost a fortune. The energy was loud and chaotic, but in that celebratory way, like it was some kind of social event of the year. I actually felt okay at first. I caught up with some cousins, made small talk with neighbors who seemed genuinely interested in my work, and even managed a brief chat with Jessica. She seemed busy, though, flitting between groups like a host, and barely acknowledged my gifts. Everything changed when Dad called everyone to the living room. My stomach dropped immediately. He was standing by the fireplace, holding a champagne glass and grinning like he'd won the lottery. Mom was beside him beaming, with Jessica next to her looking smug. It reminded me of every childhood celebration. Always the same setup, the same dynamics. "Thank you all for coming," Dad began. "It's wonderful to have everyone here for Jessica's special day." I noticed he didn't mention my birthday last month. But tonight isn't just about her birthday. We're also celebrating incredible news. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew exactly where this was going and wanted to disappear into the floor. "We're here to celebrate Jessica, who's just finished her first year at law school with flying colors." Everyone clapped. Some people even cheered, and someone whistled. Mom jumped in, going on about how proud they were, how hard Jessica had worked, and how bright her future looked. Meanwhile, I was standing in the corner, invisible as always. I clapped along with everyone else, but I couldn't help feeling like a ghost. There wasn't a single mention of my help, nothing about the money I'd sent or the years of supporting them. All my sacrifices meant nothing. It got worse. Jessica started talking about law school. At first, it seemed interesting, then she started bragging. "Law school is no joke," she announced, looking right at me. "Not like a regular 9-to-5 job. It takes real intelligence and dedication. You can't just wing it." Each word was clearly aimed at me. I tried brushing it off, but then she went for the kill. "I mean, architectural design? That's something anyone can learn online. Not exactly rocket science." The room got quiet for a moment. I could hear a few uncomfortable coughs. I glanced around the room, expecting someone to say something, but instead, my parents laughed. Dad even nodded in agreement. I felt the blood rushing to my face. I was standing there, having worked my ass off to support them, while they mocked my career and everything I'd achieved. All my professional success, like it meant nothing. Then a neighbor I've known since childhood approached me. Mrs. Anderson had always been nice to me. "David, you're doing great, right? I heard you're working in architecture," she said, seeming genuinely interested. Before I could answer, Mom jumped in and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, he's doing okay," she said. "But Jessica is the real star of the family. She's going to be a lawyer, you know." She didn't even let me speak for myself. Dad chuckled and added, "David's good at what he does, but it's not exactly prestigious," in the same condescending tone he'd always used with me. I had to escape. I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending to check on the food. My hands were shaking while I held onto the counter. I just needed a minute to breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in. From the kitchen, I could still hear them. Mom telling relatives about Jessica, how they had to step in to help her because David wasn't pulling his weight. I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. It was a complete flip of the truth. I had paid her tuition. I had sent them money every month. Yet they were painting me as the failure. Years of support meant nothing. All those extra jobs, sleepless nights, and skipped meals. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't take one more second of this. I grabbed my coat and left without saying a word. They barely noticed. Jessica was too busy basking in the attention, and my parents were too busy praising her. I left my gifts on the table. They didn't even open them. I walked to the train station in the dark, freezing Michigan night, but I couldn't feel the cold. I was too numb inside. After that night, something just switched off in me. It was like flipping a circuit breaker. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment, more like a slow realization that I couldn't live like this anymore. I had been sacrificing everything and getting nothing back. Years of bending over backward, trying to be good enough. For what? To be laughed at behind my back? Treated like an afterthought? Everything I achieved, all my success meant nothing to them. The next day, my phone started buzzing with non-stop messages. First from Mom, then Dad, and finally Jessica. They all wanted to know why I left the party early. "Didn't even say goodbye," Mom's text read, like that was the worst crime. I ignored them all and turned my phone off. I needed space to think, but the calls kept coming. Eventually, I picked up when Mom called again. My hands were shaking while answering, but I figured I'd finally tell the truth. I took a deep breath. "Mom, I left because I'm tired," I said. "Tired of being treated like I don't matter." My voice was steadier than I expected. "I've been helping you all for years. All I hear is how I'm a disappointment. You and Dad were laughing about me at the party. What's the point of helping if that's how you see me?" My hands were trembling, but I kept going. There was a long pause on her end. I could hear her shuffling around, and then she sighed. That disappointed mom sigh, the same one from my childhood. "David, you're overreacting," she said. "You know how proud we are of Jessica. She's doing something really impressive. We just want to celebrate her achievements. It's not about you." It was the same excuses as always. "Exactly," I shot back. "It's never about me. Not even a single mention at the party. Not once." My voice was cracking, but I didn't care. When people asked about me, you brushed it off like my career doesn't matter. I listed every achievement they had ignored. I'm done feeling like this. Done sending money. Figure it out without me. I felt a weight lifting as I said it. Her tone changed immediately like flipping a switch. "David, don't be ridiculous," she said. "You can't just stop helping. We've done so much for you. Raised you, supported you. This is what family does. We all chip in." I nearly laughed at that last part. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Really, Mom? Because it doesn't feel like a team effort. It feels like I'm the only one chipping in while you and Dad sit back, praising Jessica for being the perfect child." Years of resentment came pouring out. She started to argue, but I cut her off. "I'm serious, Mom. I'm done. Don't call asking for money anymore." My voice was firm, no wavering. I hung up before she could respond, then threw my phone across the room and sat in the dark for hours. The calls didn't stop, though. Dad tried reaching out next. I didn't answer and blocked his number too. Then I got a text from Jessica. "You're really putting a strain on Mom and Dad. This is selfish, David." That word again. Selfish. Always their favorite weapon. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide whether to reply. Finally, I did. "Selfish? Really? If anyone's selfish here, it's you." Her response came instantly. "I didn't ask you to pay my tuition. You chose to do that. Don't blame me for your decisions." Each word was like ice. That was the moment I realized how far apart we'd drifted. There was nothing left of the sister I once knew. I blocked her too. I knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but I couldn't deal with her attitude anymore. It felt like cutting off an infected limb. The first month after stopping the money transfers was strange. I kept expecting my phone to ring with another guilt trip or angry message, but it was quiet. Too quiet, honestly, like the calm before a storm. I jumped every time my phone buzzed. At first, I felt guilty. I had been supporting them for so long that it felt wrong to just stop, even though I had every right to. Years of conditioning are hard to break. I kept checking my bank account and almost transferred money a few times. My parents didn't give up easily, though. After a few weeks of silence, they started reaching out through others, using flying monkeys, as they say. Aunt Judy called one night. I could tell she was uncomfortable with the whole situation. "David, I don't want to get in the middle of this," she began. "But your mom is really upset. She says you're refusing to help them. What's going on?" I had always liked Aunt Judy. She was the only one who ever stood up to Mom. I had to sigh. "I'm just done, Aunt Judy. They've been taking advantage of me for years. I can't do it anymore. I'm not their bank. If they're upset, that's on them." My voice was shaking, but I stayed firm. She didn't argue, which I appreciated. "I understand," she said after a moment. I could hear sympathy in her voice. "But they're struggling, David. You might want to think about helping, even just a little bit." It was the classic family guilt tactics. I thanked her for her advice, but didn't take it. I changed the subject to her garden. I had already made up my mind. There was no going back now. I started seeing things clearer once I stopped giving in to people who took me for granted. It was like a fog lifting from my eyes. I started thinking about all the times I'd bent over backward for my family and how little they'd done in return. When I moved to Chicago, they didn't help at all, not even a ride to the train station. I had to take a taxi with all my stuff. When I got my first promotion, they didn't celebrate. They didn't even remember what position it was. But when Jessica got into law school, it was like the second coming. There was a party, announcements, social media posts, even a local paper article. Looking back, I realized the truth. They never saw me as a person with my own goals and dreams. To them, I was just the older brother, the one who had to make sacrifices so Jessica could shine. I was just a walking checkbook, an ATM with legs, the family cash cow. A few months after I stopped sending money, I finally heard from Jessica again. I hadn't heard much since I blocked her. I thought she'd moved on, found other ways to manage. Apparently, things weren't so smooth. Life hits different when the bank of brother closes. I still remember the exact moment she called. It was a Wednesday evening, and I had just gotten home from work. I was taking off my shoes when my phone lit up with her name on the screen. I debated not answering. What could she possibly say? My finger hovered over the decline button, but curiosity won out, and I picked up. "David," she said. No hello, no small talk, just my name like loading a gun. I could tell she was preparing for something. "What's up?" I asked, though I already knew what was coming. She sighed. I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Look, I need your help. Second-year tuition is due, and Mom and Dad say they can't pay it. I've tried getting scholarships, but nothing's available right now. I don't know what to do." Her voice sounded practiced, rehearsed. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, processing her request. "Jessica, I already helped with the first year. I told you I couldn't keep doing this. You knew that." Her tone shifted immediately. The desperation was still there, but now it had a sharp edge, like she was annoyed with me. "Yeah, but I thought you'd understand how important this is. If I don't pay, I could get kicked out." Her voice was getting higher. "Do you have any idea what that would look like? Everyone knows I'm in law school. If I drop out, it'll be humiliating for me and the family." It was all about appearances. I sat up straight. Her words hit me like a slap. "Jessica, Are you seriously more worried about how it'll look than the fact that you might get kicked out? That's what you care about? She didn't hesitate. Of course I care about that. I've worked so hard to get here. I can't let it fall apart because you suddenly decided to be selfish. That word again, their favorite weapon. But that word stung less now. It made me angry instead. Selfish, I repeated, laughing bitterly. I'm selfish because I finally said no? Years of resentment filled my voice. She groaned like I was being unreasonable. David, I'm not asking you to support me forever. Just this one time, okay? I'll pay you back once I'm a lawyer. You know I will. The same empty promises. That was the part that really got to me. She didn't even realize what she was asking. To her, it was just this one time. To me, it was years of being taken for granted. History repeating itself. I knew if I gave in now, it wouldn't be the last time. There would always be one more thing. I couldn't keep doing it. No, Jessica, I said firmly. I'm done. Figure this out yourself. There was no wavering in my voice. She was quiet for a second. I thought maybe she was processing what I'd said. Then she spoke, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it before. You know what, David? Fine, be that way. Don't come crying to me when you need something. At least I'm trying to do something with my life, unlike you. Each word was calculated to hurt. I didn't even respond. I just hung up and blocked her number again, this time permanently. The next news about Jessica came through relatives. The family gossip network never sleeps. She'd been venting to everyone who'd listen about how I refused to help, how it was all my fault she was struggling. She was playing the victim as usual. Mom and Dad backed her up, of course. They were painting me as the villain, their new favorite family story. Over the next few months, things started unraveling for Jessica. Without my financial support, she had to take on part-time work, waitressing at a local diner, something she'd called beneath her before. It cut into her study time. She started falling behind in classes, missed important deadlines, and skipped crucial study groups. By semester's end, she'd failed a couple of courses. Not just bad grades, she actually failed. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit bad. She was clearly in over her head, watching her dream crumble. It was obvious that Mom and Dad weren't stepping up to help the way I had. They were all talk, no action. But I couldn't bring myself to care much. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had to keep reminding myself of that. Every so often, I heard updates through the family grapevine about how she was doing. Relatives couldn't help but share. Some tried making me feel guilty. If only you'd helped a little more, things would have turned out differently. Classic guilt-tripping tactics. But I knew better now. Jessica's situation wasn't my fault. It took therapy to accept that. It was the result of years of entitlement, unrealistic expectations, and my parents spoiling her rotten. By the time summer rolled around, big news hit the family circle. Jessica had officially dropped out of law school. Her dreams of being a lawyer were gone. The stress of balancing work and school had been too much. She couldn't keep up anymore. Her perfect world was crumbling. I didn't feel good about it. I didn't feel bad either. I just felt nothing. Years of emotional manipulation does that to you. I was just whatever at this point, like watching a stranger's life unfold. After Jessica dropped out, things started spiraling for the whole family. I wasn't directly involved anymore, but updates came through anyway. Various relatives, mutual acquaintances, the small-town gossip machine. I didn't go looking for information, but it had a way of finding me. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everyone's business. The first thing I heard about was Jessica moving back in with my parents. She couldn't make it on her own after losing her student status. The golden child was returning home with her tail between her legs to the same house where she'd been the star child just a few years ago. What a fall from grace. At first, I thought my parents would be happy to have her back. She was their golden child after all, their precious future lawyer. But from what I heard, things weren't exactly smooth, and that's an understatement of the year. Jessica had grown used to living on her own and wasn't thrilled about being under their roof again. Once you've tasted freedom, it's hard to forget. She clashed with them constantly about money, house rules, about everything. There were daily screaming matches. One of our old neighbors, Mrs. Thompson, ran into me at the grocery store when I was visiting a friend in town. She loved gossip and didn't care if it was her place to tell me. Classic small-town busybody. David, I don't mean to pry, which meant she absolutely did. But I've been hearing some arguments coming from your parents' house. Is everything all right over there? The concern in her voice wasn't entirely fake. I just shrugged and tried to seem indifferent. I wouldn't know, Mrs. Thompson. I haven't talked to them in a while. I kept my voice neutral. She gave me a knowing look. She didn't believe me but kept going anyway. Well, it's just that Jessica seems to be struggling a bit. I see her around town sometimes, and she doesn't look too happy. That was an understatement of the century. And your father. Let's just say he's not his usual cheerful self. There was more screaming than usual, apparently. The next big update came from Aunt Judy. She called me one evening, her voice heavy with concern. We hadn't spoken much since everything went down, but she was always the one who tried mediating conflicts. The family peacekeeper. David, she started, I just wanted to let you know things are getting tough for your parents. I could hear the worry in her voice. I leaned back in my chair, already bracing for the guilt trip. What's going on? I asked, though part of me already knew. Well, Aunt Judy continued, drawing out the word, your dad lost his job a few weeks ago. Some kind of incident at work. I don't know the full story. There was something about a workplace violation. More like he was forced to resign. And your mom, bless her, has been trying to pick up more hours at the grocery store, but it's not enough. I could hear the strain in my aunt's voice. I didn't say anything right away. Part of me felt bad. Losing a job is never easy, especially at their age. Dad was pushing 60, but another part thought that maybe this was karma finally catching up after years of treating people badly. I just thought you should know, Aunt Judy continued. They're really struggling to make ends meet. And with Jessica back home, well, it's been hard on everyone. Classic understatement. I took a deep breath before responding. I appreciate you letting me know, Aunt Judy, but there's nothing I can do. I've already done more than my fair share. My voice was firmer than I expected. She didn't argue after that. She was always more understanding than the others, but the call left me feeling uneasy. I wasn't second-guessing my decision, but it was hard not to think about how things had gotten here, with the family falling apart. As months went by, I started hearing more about things deteriorating at my old home. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Dad, once the breadwinner, was now struggling to find work. The incident at work had been serious enough that it made it hard for him to get hired anywhere. Something about harassment. Nobody would touch him. Meanwhile, Mom was burning herself out trying to pick up the slack, working as many shifts as possible. From what I heard, she was looking 10 years older these days. Then, there was Jessica. She wasn't working much from what I heard. She spent most of her time at home, playing video games and scrolling through social media, living in my parents' basement. She had gone from being the golden child to a 20-something failure living in her parents' basement. I could only imagine how that affected her ego, the former star now fallen. It wasn't long before neighbors started noticing the tension. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one who'd heard the arguments. The whole street was talking now. Apparently, they were loud enough to draw attention from half the street. Windows are always open in summer. One of my cousins told me that Dad and Jessica got into it one night, screaming at each other so loudly that someone actually called the police. It was the first time that had ever happened at that house. They didn't do anything, my cousin explained. But it's pretty bad over there. David, I don't blame you for keeping your distance. I could hear genuine concern in his voice. The final straw came when Dad tried reaching out to me directly. I didn't expect that. He called from an unfamiliar number, probably because I'd blocked his usual one classic dad move. At first, I didn't recognize his voice. It was hoarse and tired, like he'd aged 10 years in just a few months. I'd never heard him sound so defeated. David, he said, his tone softer than I expected. I know we've had our differences, but I need to talk to you. It's important. His voice was almost breaking. I didn't say anything right away. I waited to see where this was going, my heart pounding in my chest. We're in a bit of a tight spot, he continued. I was wondering if you could help us out, just until I get back on my feet. It was the same old story. I closed my eyes, trying to keep my frustration in check, my hands gripping the phone tight. Dad, I already told you I'm done. I can't keep bailing you out, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not asking for much, he said quickly. Just enough to cover the bills for a couple of months. Please, David, we're your family. That word again, family. It was always their go-to when they wanted something, like a magic spell they thought would work. I'm sorry, I said, my voice firmer than expected. I surprised myself with the strength in it. He tried to argue, but I hung up before he could get too far. I blocked this number too. I knew if I let him keep talking, I would start feeling guilty again. I couldn't afford to go down that road, not after everything. I needed to stay strong for my own sake, for my own survival. That was the last time I spoke to any of them. The door was finally closed. It's been almost a year since I cut ties with my family, and honestly, I feel like a completely different person. It's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. When I think back to last year's birthday party, where I was stressed, broke, and constantly worried about disappointing people who never cared about me, living on the edge of a panic attack, I can hardly believe how far I've come. It feels like a different lifetime. It's not like everything is perfect now, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm in control. I'm finally breathing freely. After I stopped sending money to my family, I suddenly had all this extra breathing room, financially speaking. It was strange at first. I didn't know what to do with the money. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for so long that I didn't even know what to do with extra funds. I kept checking my bank account, unable to believe the numbers were real. For the first few months, I saved as much as possible, just in case something unexpected came up. Trust issues don't disappear overnight. But as my savings grew, I realized I could finally start doing things for myself, giving myself permission to live my life. Small things at first. A better chair for my desk, new clothes that actually fit, little upgrades to my apartment. The first time I bought new sheets and got actual matching towels. Nothing extravagant, but it felt good to finally invest in myself. Each purchase felt like a victory. Work became a huge focus this past year. I've made some big strides professionally. Not long after everything went down, I got a promotion at my company. My boss noticed the change in me, and now I'm leading a small team of architects working on a project that could really put us on the map, a design for a new city museum. It's exciting, but also a lot of pressure, the biggest project of my career so far. The funny thing is, I'm handling the pressure better than I ever thought I could. My mind is clearer now. I think cutting ties with my family freed up so much mental energy that I can now put into my work. No more 3 a.m. anxiety calls. I don't have that constant weight on my shoulders anymore. The guilt, the obligation, the stress of trying to please people who never appreciated me. It's all gone now. For the first time, I feel like I'm actually good at what I do. I don't mean that in a braggy way. I'm just stating a fact. I've stopped doubting myself so much. There's no more second-guessing every decision. Before, every time I achieved something, I would hear my parents' voices in my head downplaying it, comparing it to Jessica's accomplishments. The ghost of the past was always haunting me. But now those voices are gone, and it feels incredible to finally hear my own voice. One of the biggest changes in my life has been deciding to go back to school, something I never thought would be possible. Growing up, college always felt like an unattainable dream. My parents made sure of that. They made it clear they wouldn't help with tuition, and for a long time, I just accepted that I would never have the opportunity. My dreams were permanently on hold. But now, with my finances in better shape, I've started taking online classes in architectural engineering, walking past my mom's voice saying I wasn't smart enough. It's been a challenge balancing work and school, but it's a challenge I actually enjoy. For the first time, I'm studying what I want and learning so much. I'm already seeing how I can apply it to my job. My designs are getting better, and clients are noticing the difference. Eventually, I want to start my own business. That's my long-term goal, and the dream is getting clearer every day. I don't know exactly what it'll look like yet. Maybe my own architectural firm or a design consultancy. I already have potential clients interested. The idea of being my own boss is really motivating me. No more answering to others. Socially, things have been different too. Cutting ties with my family hasn't been easy to explain, especially to new friends or coworkers. It's always an awkward conversation when someone asks about my family. I usually give a vague answer like, "We're not really in touch," and change the subject quickly. Most people don't push further, but every now and then, someone will ask why. I can see the concern in their eyes. It's hard to sum up years of dysfunction in a single sentence. How do you explain a lifetime of manipulation? Sometimes I just say we had different priorities and leave it at that. It's better than telling the whole story. But the truth is, I don't really care what people think about it anymore. I'm finally free of that burden. I used to feel ashamed, like I had failed as a son or as a brother. Society's expectations weighed heavily on me. But now I realize that walking away was the best thing I could have done for myself. It saved my own life, really. As for my family, I haven't heard much recently. The silence is deafening sometimes. For a while, there were occasional guilt trips through relatives. The flying monkeys never stop. An aunt calling to say mom was struggling, or a cousin asking if I'd consider helping Jessica again. The same old manipulation tactics. But eventually, those calls stopped too. Even they gave up. From what I've gathered, things haven't improved much for them. Karma has a long memory. Dad still hasn't found steady work. He's too proud to take retail jobs. Mom is working even more hours to keep the house running and is looking decades older now. Jessica is still living at home and not doing much of anything. The former golden child has been tarnished. It's sad in a way. This isn't how anyone planned their life. I don't wish them harm, but I also don't feel responsible for their choices anymore. I've finally broken free of the guilt. They made their bed, and now they have to lie in it. Actions have consequences, even for golden children. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that you don't owe anyone your peace, not even family. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away, even if it feels like the hardest choice in the moment. It was the hardest but most necessary decision for me. So yeah, that's where I am now. I'm writing this from my new office. It's not perfect and it's not easy, nothing worth doing ever is. But it's mine. All mine. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted. I'm finally living my own life, with no regrets. End of my story, for now at least. New chapters are still being written, but this time I'm the author.